Everyone. We're now on to our last guest for this morning, Kerry-Jane Wallart, which I'll be introducing today. Kerry-Jane Wallart is Professor of American and Postcolonial Studies at the Université d'Orléans. Her research interests focus more specifically on Caribbean literature, including in its diasporic dimensions in Canada, the United States, and Great Britain. She has co-edited a volume on Jamaica Kincaid, published in Ouagadougou in 2019, and 2 volumes on Jean Rhys, published by 2020 and Routledge in 2023. Kerry-Jane has written extensively on Caribbean and Black Atlantic authors of the 20th and 21st centuries. Her approaches include generic hybridity, gender studies, and transmediality. She's the editor of Postcolonial Literatures and Arts and is here today to tell us about Testimonies by Proxy, Mediating Family Narratives.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I will also start, obviously, by expressing my very sincere thanks to the whole Ariel team here in Nancy for the sagaciousness they have shown in inviting Puja, who came to Orléans back in early October, and students were truly thrilled. And so was I after having just read Homegoing and the Front Page Murders. This paper, however, is not about her work, I have to say, so I hope no one will mind. I was told we were invited to discuss her work or that of other Indian authors. And I have adopted a sort of Joycean lens to understand India. You know, that Joyce thought that Ireland, the culture was to be found everywhere, but in Ireland, the territory. And I have looked for the India which is beyond these borders, which we have inherited from the colonial past in any case, and which were blurred already by the same colonial order. So I'm committing a detour, which I hope will resonate for you, the many dots to be connected to lead you back to Puja, I think, and you will find them for yourselves. So I'm discussing Bahadur's Coolie Woman, The Odyssey of Indenture. It's non-fiction, and so she's Guyanese, from British Guyana. And she was born in 1975 in New Amsterdam. There are many, many New Amsterdams, including what is now called New York. But this New Amsterdam was in Guyana. And she emigrated to the United States, actually to New York. Go figure. All of that, you know, being in America, which was supposed to be in India, but of course, Spanish-Italian navigator got his geography wrong, as you know. But so she emigrated to the United States and became a journalist. And Coolie Woman is the, it's not the story, because there's no story to be told in the end. It's a quest for the horror, as Conrad put it in Heart of Darkness. But it's around what happened, or what could have happened, to her great-grandmother, who was from a Brahmin background in Bihar in India, and who was indentured to the plantations in the West Indies. You know that after the abolition of slavery and the emancipation of the deported Africans in the Americas, especially so in the Caribbean. In French and English colonies, indentured workers were brought from the Indian subcontinent. So I have seized the opportunity of this panel about Indian journalism to reread a text I had read 10 years ago upon its publication, which shares a few common points with Puja's work. It was written as an investigation into matters not dealt with by historians, and with the means of a journalist interviews. The scope is wide of her interviewees, starting with her landlord or landlady everywhere she goes, starting with taxi drivers and helps at the desk of various libraries, but also including doctors, neighbors, family members or potential family members, etc. Bahadur follows her own path in her investigation, reconstituting some parts of the story and choosing to address a number of issues having to do with race, gender, and global inequalities, rather than creating a complete background. She is of Indian descent and takes the readers to various parts of India, but mostly Bihar, along a method that is of literary journalism, with a number of quotes, mostly epigraphs, gleaned from Derek Walcott, V.S. Naipaul, or Amitav Ghosh. The very title is borrowed from a long poem in Guyanese dialect published by David Dabedine, a Guyanese writer. But alongside her work in this book, Bahadur has been a regular contributor to the New York Times Book Review, the New York Review of Books, the New Republic, Dissident, The Nation, the Virginia Quarterly Review, the Boston Review, the Los Angeles Review of Books. In other words, she is a journalist. She's an investigative journalist. And one of the pieces that I recommend that you have a look at if you felt interested is this one about the beginning of an oil boom in her native country in Guyana that is already wreaking disasters on the social fabric of Guyana. Had I known, and I had this information, but I didn't, connect it with this day today. Had I known that I would be speaking, if I understand correctly, partly in front of master's students who work on the materiality of books, I would have included another picture that the photographs are not by Bahadur, they're by a colleague, and they're absolutely wonderful. And one of them shows a plant that was a former sugar plantation with the name of the owners on it, and the name is Booker. And this is the origin of the Booker Prize, which, as you know, was founded in 1969 with the money from indentured workers, right? And now, of course, they've done an extent, and it's a lot of money. I mean, we're used to the Goncourt, which is not a lot of money, but this is one of the differences between France and England. We think that the glory and the power are enough, but in Great Britain, the Booker Prize is a lot of money, and so they've done a lot of work on. If you look at the web page now, it's above the water, apparently. Right. So this is from the paper, but I'm going to skip. In Coolie Woman, the Odyssey of Adventure, she turns to journalist skills to the reimagining a narrative of what might have happened to one of her ancestors who migrated from India to Guyana. This is the museum that's dedicated to the memory of the indentured workers in Mauritius. It's really the same period, the same reasons, and the same colonial trade circuit. And one of the exhibitions showing pictures, because really this is all the archives that are left, right, along with a few logbooks. And I wanted to share with you a declaration that she has, or an article that she has written in the Guardian about writing this book. And I thought that this was one of the dots to be connected back to Puja, the fact that she questions the records as aggressively as she could, but also her own implication, right? The fact that she's probably trying to be objective. This is how she would formulate, but she cannot be neutral, because this is partly what she is and is about. And so what she does throughout is she collects archives that could have been compared to her own story, right? She finds no traces of her great-grandmother, no traces of her grandfather, who was actually born on that trip between Kolkata and Georgetown, but she finds similar pieces or documents, and this is one of them, right? That's borrowed from a logbook from the juror in 1891, and she writes at the bottom, "How was it that my grandfather escaped this oblivion?" with this question again of the oblivion, right? The reality of absence, right? This presence of loss. The list of the archives that she goes to is, however, extremely long. It would include the India Office Family History Records, the parliamentary papers held at the British Library at St. Pancras, the New York Public Library, the Walter Watney archives in Georgetown, newspapers in the British Guiana, Manchester University, John Rylands Library, Colonial Office documents, but also private archives in Inverness and Georgetown. But for all of that time spent interviewing descendants and comparing similar stories, scrutinizing archives on 3 continents, Bahadur reaches a black hole or a superimposition of versions which can never quite fit together. In this respect, she renders an implicit analysis on the powers of literature to keep perspectives intact and to navigate the distortions of time, but also impressions and feelings, or even narrative conventions and strategies. So this is a text that she writes comparing the 2 visits that she made to the village that her great-grandmother was thought to have originated from. One is in 2005, one is in 2008, and she will interview the same persons, and they would say different things, right, about what they know or what they have been told, or what they sometimes even remember. So as Jean Rees, another Kerwin author, wrote, there is always the other side, and that other side can never be entirely contained or elucidated. This very incompatibility of versions works as an incentive, of course, to go forward rather than backwards and to explore other stories, right? And so at one point in the narrative, she has to acknowledge the fact that her quest is going nowhere, but that she has gleaned so much along the way that it even constitutes a solace against the silence wrought by history and its asymmetries, right? And what's interesting is that she goes back to fiction, right? This is taken from a visit to prison. So I thought again of Puja, who visited quite a few prisons in her career. So she goes to a prison in New Amsterdam and meets someone who's murdered his wife. And so she discusses domestic abuse. Which is by official figures, which are probably highly unreliable, higher is twice that of the United States and 3 times that of the UK. And so she meets this murderer and says that he tells her the old indenture era stereotype plot about provocation and punishment. And so she notices how murders of wives throughout the colonial time and then the post-colonial time has followed the same pattern of telling the story of she did that and so I had to do this, right? Which in a way shows that fiction is always there in nonfiction in any case, because it is there in reality if we wish to define nonfiction as a full grasp on reality. So this comparative method of Bahadur throughout, as she indeed connects her personal history with that of other descendants of diasporic Indians having crossed 2 oceans to reach plantations in the West Indies, is that of the diasporas provoked by a global capitalism that was there throughout the colonial period. And so this is what she explains in the preface to the book, that she was inspired partly by this movement of coolitude. It's like that, that tries to connect the, finds the connections between persons who had been scattered across the globe, right? And so this is also her experience as an Indian, right, or a non-resident Indian, as they're called, or a diasporic Indian, growing up near New York, that they would find scrawled on the house such inscriptions as "Hindus go home." And so, she comments on the fact that, of course, they didn't know that they couldn't go back to India. For them, to them, Indian looking meant Indian. Certainly there was no command of the cracks that colonialism had created. She also discusses the moment when those descendants of the indentured workers could have gone back to India precisely after colonialism, at that moment of independence, when, after all, the old order, right, of making money, of excavating, of ravaging the land on plantations was being challenged. And this I didn't know, not that I know everything, but so apparently the question was out there, right? And a political decision was made not to welcome these Indians from abroad, right? Because of the social pressure, because of the economic pressure, because of the cultural gap, probably, that it would have created. And so I wanted to connect briefly with what with what Paul Gilroy explains in the Black Atlantic, that the African diasporas around the world have started elaborating or constituting or experiencing a temporality that is not linear, that is not chronological. Actually, the very notion of a chronological linearity is dominated by the framework imposed by the Enlightenment, which contradicts, right, the existence of slavery, and is contradicted in return by it, right? And so I wanted to suggest that maybe the journalism and the non-fiction that Bahadur produces has to do with that fragmentation, right, and that non-synchronicity that Gilroy sees as shared by intellectuals of the three continents, including Africa and excluding Asia this time, right? So the next slide introduces, we can go back to that paper in the discussion, but connects Bahadur to another framework, which is that of the new mobilities, right, or mobility studies. Of course, mobility was chosen against migration, which was considered to be pejorative or overly connoted, and so allows us to redefine our conceptions of place, right? And to envision how place is actually a space of mobility, right, or a space that is inherently displaced, which is exactly what happened. What happens with India in this narrative. I'm going to skip the first quote, which is also from the New Mobilities Paradigm, to move on to Benítez Rojo, who's a Cuban thinker and who defines the Caribbean as flowing outwards past the limits of its own sea, right? Where we can also think of a type of place that is everywhere, right? That migrates everywhere, including in the outskirts of Bombay, which incidentally is the first example. I'm rushing through what's left of my paper, 5 minutes left. 5 minutes. Right, to get to my third place, which my third thought, sorry, which is going to, I think, echo with what Vanessa has said about archives, right? I'm starting from Subaltern Studies, which was a school of Indian scholars in the 1980s who started looking at archives that had been kept but never looked at, right? The most prominent member, of course, of Subaltern Studies is Spivak, who actually started disagreeing with them extremely rapidly, but that's another story. But so I wanted to look at how these subaltern lives, or precarious lives, migrated towards us, and with which distortions, right? And so here my focus is really on testimony, and the testimony for others, which is a concept that is apparently absurd, right? You can only testify for yourself, you can be a witness of what you have seen, but it so happens, and Puja's work is proof to that a number of people, sometimes it's, as Suhasini was saying, sometimes it's 460, no, it was in Vanessa's paper, sometimes those persons who can't testify for themselves are 460 million persons. But so Puja explains, right, that she documents stories, right, and there's even a performative dimension, right, where reading becomes a form of loyalty, becomes a form of respect, and not just and isn't just an intellectual activity, right? And so this is exactly what Bahadur, I'm saying exactly because I see a strict similarity, but you'll tell me what you think. Bahadur explains how she has had sometimes the impression that these women were peeking through the pages, right, from behind a curtain, separating the women's quarters from the rest of the house of official history. So that's another metaphor of houses, right? We've all played in our lives with, what the house is an image for. It's an image for the British Empire. It's an image for the, body politic here. It's an image for official history. So she goes back to that traditional construction of the Indian home, where there's a public and a private space, a male and a female space. And so this is going to be a line of flight into two other works. Natalie Diaz, I'm not going to have time to discuss, but Jamaica Kincaid, who's from Antigua, Edwige Danticat, who's from Haiti, both wrote a book of nonfiction about the death of respectively her brother, who was dying of AIDS with no medical care in Antigua, and her father and uncle, the uncle having died in a detention center after having thought to be an illegal immigrant to the United States, and that was in Rome, in Florida, where she witnesses such scenes, which again go back to what Paul Gilroy was saying about the non-synchronous temporality, where she sees the examination of teeth to determine the age of young men as reminiscent of practices that we're already there at the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. And of course, notably, she explains that this testimony is for someone else because they can't. Right, I'm writing this only because they can't. I'm not going to read this long quote, but it's also about Kincaid, who's envisioning her brother, who again is dying of AIDS, on an island that bans homosexual sexualities and provides absolutely no help for victims of the pandemic. She imagines that her brother is going to be the writer of the book that she is reading at the moment. I'm going to skip that. Right, so to go back to Bahadur, she is an author who speaks for those who cannot, like Kincaid, like Danticat. A writer who measures how writing might not be only a question of talent, but also of places, and of having migrated to the global north, which of course reactivates in this quote, the Kalapani and Wagani citizens of Indian origin travel in what was supposed to be India, but is now America, on their belly, shamefully, at an advanced age, to join their children and grandchildren, right? Their grandmother had to cross a border, sorry, there's a typo there, crawling on her belly to join us. Last but one slide. This can be thought through the prism of Butler's reflection on mourning, on dispensable bodies and the exposure to the violence of visibility and reachability. Not even a retreat into one's own interiority can allow safety in this global post-colonial world, as all Caribbean authors, writers, thinkers, and journalists do. History is buried within, and the experience of uprootedness, loss, and the violence of global capitalism is outside and inside, and even in between, inscribed in and on flesh. Claudia Rankin, as you might know, is a Jamaican author who has migrated to the United States to study and is now a poet. She's written a diptych, Citizen, an American Lyric, and Just Us, an American Conversation, which are hybrid texts that combine poetry, visual arts, but also journalism, right? But also interviews that she led herself, and also journalistic pieces by others. So this was, to conclude, a detour through another work produced elsewhere. By the way, the book might be circulating, I think, about different experiences of vulnerability, but I thought that Bahadur's honesty and awareness, but also hard work, could be a form of tribute to Puja's own books and articles. And I thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much for this tribute to Puja's work, indirect, and the parallels you tried to draw between your work and hers. And we have time for a couple of questions before breaking for lunch, if somebody has a question. Yes? Thank you.
Yes, so it seems to me that there are really a lot of similarities between Bahadur's work and Puja's, but the one difference that I noticed is that, from what I've understood, Bahadur is writing from her personal history or her family's history. So I was wondering how you think that that has influenced her work in comparison to maybe, I mean, related to the fact that she is a journalist, and so she is, I mean, I'm guessing that she was heading for something that was maybe objective or impartial to some extent, and how that may have been derailed by the fact that this was personal to her, or maybe it was not.
Right. No, you're absolutely correct in pointing this out. It started, with an attempt, and she suggests it, right? She doesn't confess or she doesn't elaborate on it, but she doesn't hide the fact that it started as a sort of quest for origins, right? Something that's highly naive given the circumstances. But I mean, she grew up in New York, and they all do that. So let's have a try. And also that I think there was this past of having had to leave everything behind at the age of 10, right? So she experienced what was theorized by Stuart Hall, who's a Jamaican thinker, as the double diaspora. Stuart Hall explains that a number of Caribbean writers, thinkers have experienced a double diaspora, away from Africa or India, and then away from the Caribbean to the global north. But extremely rapidly, and to be honest with you, I don't know who this person on this particular cover is, and the one on the cover that I showed to you is another great grandmother, because she didn't have a picture of the person that she was investigating that was good enough. And so, she must have just given that to the publisher, saying, well, it's my great grandmother. It's beside the point, right? And so extremely rapidly, you can see that she goes to Georgetown and she goes to New Amsterdam to interview persons. And the story goes somewhere else, right? The story becomes that of domestic abuse, becomes that of land appropriation, becomes that of the destiny of autochthonous populations. There's also a whole chapter, sorry. I'm tired. There's a whole chapter on Scotland, right? And so she goes to a property that's entitled Rose Hill, and the plantation on which most of her ancestors were hired was also called Rose Hill, right? But there's no direct connection. And so I kept going back when reading those pages, thinking, wait, I missed the link, right? But there is no link. And so this is the point after, well, what she starts is to retrace the entire connection between Scotland and the West Indies, explaining that the same could be done about Ireland, explaining how, you know, the dirty work was done not by Londoners, right, not by the middle class in England, but by the subalterns within the United Kingdom, and so especially so during the clearances, you know, so she retraces the history of those, you know, villages that were burned to scatter the Scottish population away from these roots, but also away from their cultures, from their traditions, from their language. It was also a way of, you know, forcing them to speak English. And so that entire chapter about, you know, where she goes to archive, so she's in Scotland the whole time, and it's apparently unrelated, right? But it's got everything to do with. And so, you know, this is so you're absolutely right. I think the trigger was really to find her, you know, legacy, but it became something else. So this is what I thought was interesting there, because there was, you know, it was impossible otherwise, because because individuals were not individuals, right? So records were never, you know, with names, but it touches upon so much that happened in the world in the past 5 centuries that the material is just, you know, it's like, you know, it's like a volcano, and it keeps spurting out, you know, spurting out. So
Other questions? Oh, yes, Vanessa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your talk. Thank you very much for your talk, which was fascinating, and indeed we could see the echoes with Puja's work. I'm very interested in the generic hybridity, which is something that you work on a lot, because you talked about Bahadur reconstituting part of the story, reimagining a narrative of what might have happened. So it seems that we, of course, you did a lot of research, but at the same time, the words you use make us think of fiction. So I was wondering, I haven't read that book. Do you feel sometimes that it's veering on a kind of imaginative style or not?
Yes, it is. You know, so you don't know if it's for the comfort of the reader, because there's so many, you know, missing episodes that she imagines what it was to be on one of those ships, etc. But for me, the truly literary interest of this text is that of perspective. It's the calling into question of the source of enunciation, or of the poster, of the, you know, the positionality, as is often used nowadays. And this is something that she makes explicit several times. It's about her figure as both the narrator, so, you know, the thread, and a protagonist. And so I was extremely marked by the moments when she starts having to justify herself, the personal choices. For instance, all of the moments when she goes to India, people tell her that she should come back, or worse, that she should live here. That, you know, they make it a sort of guilt that, you know, they left, and she was from a Brahmin background, and so she should be the one living here, and she, you know, with her education, this, that. And so this is where I see the reflection on, you know, what it is to write a story. It's really that superimposition of layers, you know, the author, the narrator, the protagonist, the witness, to some extent. Yes, yes, and indeed, of course, she there's a lot of material, but that material is not written out, right? It's not narrated, so she does the narration.
Maybe we can continue this over lunch. So thank you again. Let's thank our guests.